The morning I found concrete barriers blocking my driveway for the third time that week, something in me snapped quietly. Each one was stamped with the county seal, but I knew better. The county doesn't pour random concrete in front of private property, especially not this far out near the lake. Somebody wanted to make a statement. The cabin was quiet. My wife was still asleep inside, and for a moment, I thought about letting it go again, just calling the county, asking them to haul the barriers away one more time. But a voice in the back of my head whispered, "This isn't going to stop." I sat on the porch steps and took a deep breath, watching the morning mist drift over the lake. That's when I heard the faint rumble of an engine in the distance. It was too early for deliveries, and nobody else lives this far down the road except for one person, the woman who moved in 2 lots over last spring, Karen. I'd only met her once, briefly. She'd come by with a clipboard, talking about community standards and property appearance. I'd told her politely that I wasn't under any HOA's authority. She'd smiled tight, artificial, and said, "Oh, that's not what my records say." I hadn't thought much of it since. But now, with those barriers lined up like soldiers on my driveway, the pieces started fitting together. I stood up, drained the last of my cold coffee, and stared down the road toward her place. If it was her, this wasn't just about concrete. It was about control. And I've dealt with enough control freaks in my life to know once you let them take an inch, they'll pave over a mile. This time, I wasn't moving those barriers myself. I was going to find out exactly who thought they had the right to put them there. And if it really was Karen behind it, then she was about to learn what happens when you push the wrong man too far. People often mistake patience for weakness. They see a man who doesn't raise his voice, who takes his time, and they assume he's passive. They don't realize patience is the hardest kind of strength, the kind you earn through years of swallowing your pride, keeping your hands steady, and counting to 10 while the world tests you. I learned that lesson the hard way in sandstorms, on flooded construction sites, and through long nights fixing what others broke. 26 years in the Army Corps of Engineers teaches you to build things right, to measure twice, and cut once, and above all, to stay calm under pressure. Out there, mistakes cost lives. Here, in civilian life, mistakes just cost your peace. That morning, as I stood looking at those barriers again, I reminded myself, don't act angry. Act precise. Anger burns fast. Precision lasts. I went inside, set my phone on the counter, and opened the old file cabinet next to my desk. Inside were 2 decades worth of property record surveys, deeds, permits. I don't trust digital copies alone. Paper doesn't disappear when a server crashes or a clerk hits the wrong button. The cabin had belonged to a friend of mine, an old Army buddy named Miller. When he passed, his wife wanted it to go to someone who'd appreciate the place, so I bought it from her for a fair price. I'd spent the past year restoring it new plumbing, new deck, cleaned up the trail down to the dock. The kind of quiet, honest work that keeps a man grounded. This land wasn't just property. It was earned peace. After decades of building bases in the desert and repairing roads during monsoon season, I didn't need much, just a bit of earth that was mine and a sunrise worth waking up for. So when someone tried to take even a sliver of that away, I felt that quiet, dangerous kind of anger settle in. Not the loud kind. The kind that sits behind your ribs and waits for the right moment. I called the county office first, just to be thorough. The clerk on the line checked my address and confirmed exactly what I already knew, "Sir. Your property is outside any HOA jurisdiction. Always has been." Good. I asked her to email me that statement and followed it up by printing the original property map with the HOA boundary clearly marked a good 100 feet away from my land. Evidence in hand, I leaned back in my chair and took a long breath. That's when I heard my wife stirring in the next room. "Tom?" she called, voice soft with sleep. You're up early again." "Yeah," I said, pouring her a cup of coffee. "You're not going to believe what's sitting at the end of our driveway." She came out wrapped in her robe, hair still messy, holding her mug with both hands. "Let me guess, those concrete blocks again?" For a second, she looked amused, not surprised, just quietly knowing. "You let me handle this," she said, almost too calmly. I frowned. "No offense, honey, but she's already playing dirty. This is starting to look like harassment." She just smiled. The kind of smile I'd learned meant she knew something I didn't. "Trust me, Tom. Some people only learn respect when they realize who they're talking to." I didn't press her for details. Not yet. My wife's never been one to bluff, and I've learned that when she has that look, something's brewing. Still, I wasn't about to sit on my hands. I spent the rest of that morning sketching out a plan, called the sheriff to report trespassing, maybe set up a camera at the entrance, document everything. The soldier in me needed order, proof, and a clean line of command. But deep down, something about my wife's tone stuck with me. There was a quiet confidence there, not anger, not outrage, but certainty. Like she already held the upper hand and was just waiting for the right time to play her card. I didn't know it yet, but she wasn't bluffing. And before the week was over, Karen would find out the hard way just how much power my wife actually had over this neighborhood. Why the next morning, the fog over the lake was thick enough to blur the shoreline. I stood at the end of the porch, hands in my pockets, watching the world wake up slow. The barriers were still there, 3 gray sentinels guarding a driveway I couldn't use. That sight told me one thing: whoever did this wasn't afraid of being caught. They were making a statement. I finished my coffee, grabbed my truck keys, and decided it was time to start collecting answers. The first stop was my neighbor, Carl, the kind of guy who noticed everything because he had nothing better to do. He lived a few properties up the road, retired electrician, spent most of his mornings tinkering with his boat. It was a delivery notice, a carbon copy with the logo of a local concrete supplier in town. Someone had ordered temporary boundary markers and signed for them using a name scrawled in looping handwriting. Karen. That was the confirmation I needed. Not speculation, not a hunch, evidence. I took photos of the tag and the tire marks, then folded the slip carefully into my jacket pocket. Back inside, I laid everything out on the kitchen table: photos, documents, notes like a battlefield map. My wife came over quietly, looked it all over, and nodded once. "So, she really went through with it," she said. "Tried to treat your land like it's part of her playground." "Yeah," I said. "I've got enough to report her for trespassing." My wife smiled faintly. "Do that if you want. But I think it'll be more satisfying to let her dig her own hole a little deeper first." There was something almost mischievous in her voice. I couldn't tell if she was angry or entertained. Maybe both. I didn't know her plan yet, but I trusted her judgment. In 20 years of marriage, she'd never been wrong about people, especially the self-righteous kind. So, I decided to wait one more day. Let Karen make her next move. Because something told me when she did, she'd go too far. And that's when we'd finally be ready to end this, once and for all. The next morning, the sound of gravel crunching outside woke me up before sunrise. I stepped onto the porch just in time to see a white SUV idling at the end of my driveway. The headlights cut through the mist, and then the driver's door opened. Out stepped Karen, clipboard in one hand, coffee tumbler in the other, dressed like she was running a corporate meeting instead of strolling through the woods. Her lips were pursed so tight they could have sliced a lemon. She walked straight toward the barriers, heels clicking against the gravel like a metronome of arrogance. "Morning," she called out, voice syrupy but sharp underneath. "I hope you haven't tried moving these again." I stayed silent for a second, letting the steam from my mug rise between us like a wall. "Good morning to you too, Karen," I said finally. "You're up early." She tilted her head, that performative smile stretching across her face. Yes, well, I noticed last time someone had tampered with the HOA boundary markers. I wanted to make sure things are being respected. Boundary markers? I asked. Those are concrete barriers. On my private property. Private? She repeated, raising an eyebrow. Actually, this section falls within the Lakeside HOA's jurisdiction. According to my records, the previous owner never filed an exemption form. So technically, this land is still subject to community regulation. I couldn't help but let out a short laugh, not mocking, just tired. Karen, I built bases in deserts and hospitals on mountaintops. You think I don't know how to read a property line? This cabin isn't under your HOA. Never has been. Her smile flickered. Well, perhaps you're mistaken. The records I have clearly show this area is pending incorporation. You can't just build whatever you want, Mr. Brady. We have standards here. Standards, I repeated slowly. And those include trespassing and blocking driveways? She blinked. I didn't trespass. I'm enforcing the bylaws. Which bylaws? I asked, crossing my arms. She turned sharply, offended that I wasn't intimidated. I'll be filing a formal complaint this afternoon. Expect to hear from the HOA board soon. Looking forward to it, I said, voice calm. She stomped back toward her SUV, muttering something about non-compliance under her breath. I watched her drive off, taillights glowing red through the mist. Behind me, my wife stepped onto the porch, arms crossed. That woman's writing checks her authority can't cash, she said quietly. Yeah, I replied. But she's convinced she owns the bank. My wife smiled faintly. Then maybe it's time we remind her who actually does. For the first time in days, I felt something other than frustration, anticipation. Whatever my wife had planned, it was clear she wasn't bluffing. And something told me, when Karen tried to bring her HO aboard into this, she was going to walk straight into her own trap. For a few days after that little showdown, things went quiet. Too quiet. No more subs idling outside, no letters taped to my fence, no mysterious men with clipboards. I thought maybe, just maybe, Karen had found another poor soul to bully. Maybe someone's fence slats weren't community beige enough for her liking. But peace in a neighborhood run by people like her never lasts long. The calm broke on a Tuesday morning when I found a fresh notice pinned to my gate. This time, it wasn't handwritten or duct-taped. It was laminated, official-looking, printed with HOA logos and legal jargon that could make your eyes cross. A T the top in bold letters. I laughed, short and humorless. Aesthetic alignment? You mean existing outside your bubble of beige? Her tone stiffened. Sir, our regulations exist to maintain property values. You can submit an appeal through the board. That night, a motion light caught someone walking along the back of my fence line, again camera in hand. This time, I stepped outside before they could bolt. The flash of the lens froze them mid-step. It wasn't some random neighbor. It was a man in an HOA polo shirt, complete with badge lanyard and clipboard. Evening, I said, voice calm but sharp. You taking pictures of my property? He froze, stammered something about routine inspections. Routine? I asked. Because from where I'm standing, that's trespassing. He turned pale. I'm authorized by the board. Authorized by who? I took one slow step closer. Because unless your board's name is on my deed, you're not authorized to set foot here. He backed away fast, nearly tripping over a root before running off toward the cul-de-sac. By the next morning, 3 more letters had arrived, one claiming I owed $40,000 in non-compliance penalties. Another threatened to seek legal remedy. That's when my wife stepped in. She'd been quiet through most of this, letting me vent and fume. But that morning, She walked into the kitchen, laptop under her arm, calm as a surgeon. "You know," she said, "there's something funny about Ridgepoint." I raised an eyebrow. "Funny?" She turned the screen toward me, and a registry lookup page, with several property filings pulled up. "Their corporate charter isn't filed under Ridgepoint HOA," she said. "It's under Westbrook Property Management, LLC. "Westbrook," I repeated. "Karen's name." "Exactly," my wife said. "And according to this, the LLC's registration status is suspended, which means every action they've taken under that banner has no legal standing." I just stared at her, jaw slack. "You're telling me the HOA that's been fining us, threatening us, doesn't legally exist?" "On paper," she said, smiling faintly, "they're a ghost. Every letter they've sent? Every fine? It's just intimidation with a letterhead." I couldn't help but grin. "So we can hit back?" She nodded. "Oh, we're going to do more than that. We're going to remind Karen that she's been swinging a plastic sword." Inside were printouts, HOA filings, property maps, legal notices, all meticulously highlighted and annotated. Every page was a breadcrumb trail leading to one truth: Karen's empire was built on sand. "She never renewed her charter," my wife said, tapping one page with a red underline. "Which means every board action she's taken since last June is null and void. And get this, the HOA insurance policy expired 2 months ago." I let out a low whistle. "So technically, they've got no authority and no coverage." That's when I decided we weren't just going to fight back. We were going to expose her. I spent the next 2 days digging through county property records. I found discrepancies, lines that didn't match up, signatures that didn't belong to current officials. Turns out, Karen had been filing HOA claims against properties not even inside her jurisdiction. She was expanding her control like a land baron, one bogus document at a time. My wife called it suburban colonization. I called it exactly what it was: fraud. We knew we needed proof that would hold up in public, not just on paper. So we set a trap. The following Saturday, Ridgepoint HOA held one of their infamous community cleanup days, basically a PR stunt where they handed out muffins and lectured everyone about property aesthetics. It was the perfect opportunity. Karen was there, of course, standing under a white canopy with a clipboard, barking orders like a drill sergeant who'd never seen a day of real discipline. She spotted us immediately, her smile tight as fishing line. "Well, if it isn't the Bradys," she said, her tone honeyed, but her eyes sharp. "I hope you're here to finally cooperate." It was like a switch flipped. Whispers started to ripple through the group. Someone pulled out their phone. Another person muttered, "Wait, she fined us for that fence last year." Karen's composure cracked, her smile trembling under the weight of a dozen eyes. My wife closed her laptop softly. "We'll be submitting this evidence to the county clerk and the state licensing division. Oh, and Karen, since your LLC is suspended, you might want to get a lawyer before sending any more threats." Karen tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Her clipboard slipped, paper scattering across the gravel like fallen leaves. I leaned in just enough for her to hear me clearly. "Next time you think about putting up concrete barriers, make sure you're standing on solid ground." We turned and walked away as the murmurs grew louder behind us, neighbors circling her, asking questions she couldn't answer. By the time we reached the truck, I looked back one last time. Karen stood alone under that white canopy, her fake authority collapsing like wet cardboard. It wasn't over yet, but for the first time, it felt like the tide had turned. I should have known Karen wouldn't take her public humiliation lying down. 3 days after the HOA meeting fiasco, I came home to find a thick envelope wedged into my mailbox, stamped certified legal notice. My wife opened it at the kitchen table, scanning the pages while I poured coffee. She didn't say a word at first, just gave that long, slow exhale that meant something was about to ruin our weekend. "She's suing us," she finally said. "Defamation, harassment, and interference with HOA operations." I laughed before I could stop myself. "She's suing us? After all that?" But when I read the complaint, my smile faded. She'd actually filed through a local firm, probably one of those small-town lawyers who didn't know what they were getting into. The language was official, the claims absurd. According to Karen, I'd disrupted the governance of Ridge Point Estates and caused her emotional distress and reputational harm. "She's grasping at straws," my wife said. "But if we ignore this, it could get messy." I nodded, feeling that old army discipline settle in. Then we don't ignore it. We end it. We filed our response within 48 hours, and my wife, being the strategist she is, didn't just hire a lawyer. She called in one of her old colleagues from her corporate days, a litigation shark from the city who didn't just play defense, she counterattacked. When Karen got the counterclaim notice, the look on her face must have been priceless. Because this time, we weren't just denying her accusations. We were suing her back for fraudulent misrepresentation, harassment, and trespassing. The court date came faster than I expected. On the morning of the hearing, the county courthouse looked almost cinematic pale sunlight streaming through the tall windows, the low hum of voices echoing off marble floors. Karen sat at the plaintiff's table, dressed in a bright red blazer, flipping through her stack of color-coded binders like she was about to win a school debate. Her lawyer, a younger man with too much gel in his hair, looked nervous. My wife and I sat quietly behind our attorney, calm as ever, because unlike Karen, we had something she didn't: facts. When the judge entered, the room stilled. After introductions, Karen's lawyer launched into his speech, painting her as the victim of a campaign of hostility led by a retired engineer and his wife seeking revenge. He spoke for nearly 20 minutes, waving around photos of the meeting and our property. When he finally sat down, the judge turned to our attorney. "Your response?" Our lawyer stood, cool and composed. "Your Honor, this case is based entirely on false premises. The plaintiff, Mrs. Karen Doyle, is operating an unregistered and dissolved HOA entity, illegally collecting dues, issuing fines, and threatening homeowners with unauthorized enforcement actions." She handed the judge a thick folder. Inside are certified records from the Secretary of State's office, the county recorder, and the HOA registry. We also have an audio recording where the plaintiff threatens my client with property damage. Karen's lawyer shifted in his seat. The judge began flipping through the documents, his brows slowly rising. "Mrs. Doyle," he said finally, looking over his glasses, "are you aware that your HOA charter was suspended over a year ago?" Karen opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her lawyer stammered something about clerical delays. The judge tapped his pen. "So you filed lawsuits and collected funds under a defunct organization?" Karen's face flushed crimson. "It wasn't defunct, it was just illegal," the judge finished. "That's the word you're looking for." A quiet chuckle rippled through the courtroom. Our lawyer leaned in slightly. "Your Honor, we move for immediate dismissal of her claims with prejudice and request the court to consider sanctions for misuse of the legal system." The judge nodded, flipping the last page. "Motion granted." Karen froze. Furthermore, the judge continued, "Given the evidence of improper filings, this matter will be referred to the county prosecutor for review." Still, that day, walking down those courthouse steps, I couldn't help but feel a quiet pride. Not because we'd won, but because we'd done it the right way. With facts. With patience. With backbone. And as I looked at my wife beside me, holding that same folder that had started it all, I realized something simple yet powerful. Sometimes the best revenge isn't payback.itsproof.u think after the courtroom scene, Karen would have taken the hint, maybe step back, lay low, let things cool down. But people like her don't fade away quietly. They unravel. Within a week, word spread through Ridgepoint faster than gossip at a church potluck. Everyone knew Karen's HOA wasn't legally active. Everyone knew she'd been fined herself for running an unlicensed entity. And everyone knew, thanks to one very thorough county clerk, that her name had been flagged for potential fraudulent filings. At first, I kept to myself. I didn't want to gloat. That wasn't the point. But as the days went by, it became clear the community had started to see through her act. The same neighbors who used to nod nervously when she walked by were now crossing the street to avoid her. A few bold ones even stopped by my property, shaking my hand and thanking me for finally standing up to her. One afternoon, old Mr. Donnelly, the man whose mailbox Karen once painted beige without asking, came by with a thermos of lemonade. He said, "You did what we've all wanted to do for years, son. You reminded her this isn't a dictatorship, it's a neighborhood." That one stuck with me, because that's exactly what had been missing community. Karen had built her power on fear and control. People went along because they didn't want the hassle, didn't want the letters, the threats, the fake fines. But once her authority was stripped away, it was like a fog lifted off the entire lakefront. For the first time in months, kids were playing by the water again. Someone even organized a potluck on the same grassy field Karen once called restricted common area. No one asked her permission this time. And maybe the most poetic moment came 2 weeks later, when a for sale sign appeared in front of Karen's house. Rumor had it, the county audit and her failed lawsuit drained her savings. She'd lost the insurance coverage for her supposed HOA, and with the legal costs piling up, she had no choice but to leave. The day the moving truck came, I stood on my porch again, the same spot where I'd first stared at those concrete barriers months before. My wife joined me, mug in hand, quiet as ever. We watched as Karen's movers loaded her things into the truck, stacks of binders, rolls of laminated signs, and that same folding canopy she used to preach under during community cleanup days. When Karen finally stepped out, she caught sight of us. For a brief second, our eyes met. She didn't sneer this time, didn't shout, just looked tired, like someone who'd finally realized the empire she'd built was made of paper. I gave her a small nod, not out of spite, but acknowledgement. Sometimes, even the worst battles deserve a respectful end. She looked away, climbed into her car, and drove off without a word. As the truck disappeared down the road, the neighborhood seemed to exhale. The silence wasn't awkward anymore, it was peaceful. A few weeks later, Ridgepoint held a community meeting. This time, there were no clipboards, no fines, no power trips. Just neighbors sitting on folding chairs, deciding together how to move forward. They voted to dissolve the old HOA entirely. In its place, they formed a voluntary neighborhood association, transparent, simple, with no mandatory dues. My wife was asked to help draft the charter. She smiled and said she'd help as long as it stayed voluntary. When they asked if I'd consider being president, I laughed. No thanks. I've had enough leadership for one lifetime. But before the meeting ended, one of the younger families stood up. They said they'd watched everything unfold from start to finish, how Karen's grip fell apart, how truth outlasted manipulation. The father looked over at me and said, "You reminded everyone that rules don't make a community. People do." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. That night, as the sun sank over the lake and the water reflected streaks of orange and gold, I realized the battle wasn't about property lines or paperwork. It was about something much simpler: respect. Respect for boundaries, for truth, for each other. The concrete barriers were long gone, replaced by a neat wooden fence my neighbor helped me build. Sometimes I'd run my hand along the smooth surface and think about everything that fence represented, not division, but peace. Karen's name still comes up every now and then, usually as a warning or a laugh. But mostly, people just remember her as a chapter 1 the neighborhood needed to close before it could finally move on. And me? I still drink my morning coffee on the porch, same as always. But now, when I look at that lake, I don't see tension anymore. I see stillness. Because sometimes, justice doesn't come with sirens or headlines. Sometimes, it comes in silence when the loudest voice finally goes quiet.